Okay, this is a movie that you and I have talked about for years, and one that I think when I was first kind of talking to you about, probably before you had ever seen it, and actually I kind of remember this more from you talking about me talking about it, but the idea that it transcends movies in a way that's almost even kind of hard to rank,
Yes.
that it's more of like this important emotional experience than
Yes.
it is. I mean, it is a good film. It is a very solid film. It was
hmm
nominated for 3 Oscars. But as far as the impact it has on you,
Yeah,
it just is like this soul draining, frustrating, and
for sure. Yeah, the first time that I saw this, it was on your recommendation. It was probably 2007 or 2008. Yeah, it's a movie that showed me, as a young kid, like just starting to basically watch and appreciate movies like this for the first time, like exactly how emotionally impactful a movie can be. And I didn't really plan to probably watch it ever again, just because it is,
same.
it is like,
It's exhausting in a way that's
yeah,
not insulting. I don't mean that as a slight on the film. It's just it's a lot to put yourself through. And I think what I said before too is so I don't know. I've always been fairly stoic, and even kind of now, it's mostly movies are the things that can tear me up more than real life events because I'm kind of weird like that.
mhm,
So I always remember the first movie that made me cry and tear up or whatever was Life is Beautiful from 1998. But then I always remember saying when this film came out, I cried more during Hotel Rwanda than in every other movie up to that point combined.
mhm.
Because I was the first time I watched this, like usually when I say I cry during the movie, it's like I get a tear rolling down, and now I kind of see it as like a point of pride where like I like that a movie can get me to the point where I actually have like a tear rolling down my cheek.
Mhm.
This film, the first time I watched it, I think I actually started sobbing, and I don't know if that might be still unprecedented or unparalleled in any movies I've watched. Right, actually like
And
sob.
it's not like, so when you watch a movie like Life is Beautiful, obviously you have like that there's several parts in that movie, but specifically the very end when like the kid's looking for his dad and the tank shows
Oh
up,
yeah,
like
that's the part. That's the first time I ever cried in a movie. Was that
that's the
moment?
part
Yeah.
that gets you. Yes. In this movie, there's like a dozen of those.
Right. So just to give a little bit of the background here.
You talk about like history of Rwanda.
Yeah, and so I won't go back as crazy far as I kind of was with some others. But basically, like we saw with several other of these African countries, you get Europe coming in and messing with things. So what's interesting
Yeah.
is, and so I kind of actually misunderstood, I think part of what they mentioned in the film, they kind of mentioned that there wasn't really a Hutu Tutsi split until the Europeans invented that split.
That's
That
actually
not
that's
right.
not true. Yeah.
Correct. That's yeah. So what basically that wasn't a split that already existed, but they weren't necessarily diametrically opposed as enemies until the Europeans. So
Right.
essentially, it was kind of like the nobles and the peasants is a very rough way to
Right.
looking at it.
Yeah. They basically have there's like very few differences. Like they're super similar culturally, genetically. There was no real difference, but then they got colonized, I think, first by the
Yeah,
Germans.
1885. You have German East Africa.
Yeah, it was part of Germany, East Africa. Then after World War One, they split up Germany, East Africa, and it became Rwanda, Burundi, and was under the control of the Belgians. And the Belgians, after World War One, were the ones who were like just super hardcore, went after the racial stuff as far as like skull measuring and nose measuring and your height and your skin color. Like they went hard into the racial stuff. And then they were the ones who actually printed the ID cards that you see in the movie, where you were either
Mm,
stamped a Hutu or a Tutsi. And then like they say in the movie, the Tutsis are the ones who are they're the nobles. They're minority, but that's because they're like the top, I guess you would say. They were the ones who were
got preferential treatment from the Europeans.
right. They got preferential treatment, and they were the puppets of their European colonizers. And then the Hutus were everybody else, the common folk, the peasants, the rest of the country.
Right. So, and then after 1961, they did declare independence and overwhelmingly set themselves up as a republic. But then in 1973, there was a military coup. And then you just kind of had, a couple decades of this often violent tension between the Hutu and the Tutsi, moreover, actually, in Burundi, that then started spilling over into Rwanda.
Well, because before this conflict that we see in the movie, there was a civil war, a genocide in Burundi that got like 250,000 people killed. And so that was one of the reasons why in Rwanda then it was so hard for those two groups to start to try and reconcile, because it was like, well, yeah, we tried that in Burundi and it started like, and we're still bitter over that because your ethnic group was killing my ethnic group type thing.
Right. So it's a very Israel-Palestine kind of, they just can't get along. Although there's the religious difference. Here, it's like it's only this kind of artificial difference that was.
It was literally a stamp on a card, and they even show that in the movie with Joaquin Phoenix saying, "What are you? Are you Hutu or Tutsi?" And she's like,
right, because he's like flirting with some girls, and they're like one at each, and he's like, I wouldn't be able to tell,
exactly. And you even see that. I don't know if they did this on purpose or whatever, but they talk about, the Tutsis are, they have narrower noses and lighter skin, and the Hutus are darker. But like when you show like the different characters of the movie are played by different people, and there's no rhyme or reason.
Right. It's fascinating, and then like I said, to a depressing point. So as far as the events in the movie, and I even kind of lose track of which is which as far as the Hutu or the Tutsi. Which is Don Cheadle's character running the hotel?
He's a Hutu.
He's
Hutu.
So the Hutu are the higher up ones, and the Tutsi are the peasants?
The Tutsi Tutsi are the higher up ones. The Hutu are the peasants.
Okay.
But then with this conflict, there's the flip, because now that they are independent and they're trying to do this majority rule, well, now the Hutu they're the majority.
Gotcha.
And so they're basically like trying to, pay back the Tutsis for this.
It's like the French Revolution then.
Yeah, kind of.
With like the lower caste kind of rising up.
I mean, and that's kind of fitting because the Belgians and the French are like the two European powers that are the most, have their hands in this region, or in this country at least, which they even talk about, they're constantly talking about the hotel is owned by a Belgian company, and they talk about how the Hutu rebels are being funded by the French, which is kind of controversial, I guess. The fact that like when they show in the movie, like all the Europeans get rescued, like all the foreigners get pulled out, but they don't take any refugees or anything. No one actually from Rwanda gets to leave. When the French did that, they rescued foreigners, but they also rescued a bunch of like hardliner agitators from the government that were like directly responsible for a lot of the genocide, and then also left a bunch of like supplies and stuff for the Hutu militias. But yeah, so even as recent as 1994, European powers were funding and supplying these militia groups that were these genocides.
And then I think what I kind of maybe missed in the movie is the extent to which there was violence coming from both sides. So the movie takes place it's basically the Hutus taking out the Tutsis in the spring of 94, but like in October of 93, the Tutsis assassinated the new Hutu president of Burundi. And so I guess ultimately what gave was it just the numbers? What gave the Hutu the final advantage where they were actually in a position where they could dominate the Tutsi in Rwanda? Was it just the sheer numbers game?
It was a numbers thing. Okay. But eventually the Tutsi did end up, like when they crossed the front lines at the end, and they show that there's like all those guys getting ready to push into the city. Those are all Tutsis. So they ended up winning. They ended up winning the war.
Oh, so despite the Rwandan genocide taking out mostly Tutsis, the Tutsis actually end up winning?
Yeah, because Paul Kagame he's the RPF leader. So that group that ends up taking Kigali at the end of the movie, he's the one who's leading them, and then he became they called the vice president, but he basically was the one with all of the power.
Basically the whole reason that Cheadle got to live was because he was Hutu, and the Hutus that were killing everybody were like patient with him because he was one of them.
Right.
If it was Tutsi, they would have taken him out long before.
Right. Yep. But as you see in the movie, that doesn't really matter, because as soon as they find out that his wife is Tutsi, then they say, oh, well, even though you're a Hutu, you're a traitor. You're just as bad. And they obviously don't actually care about the difference, because you see the army come up and he says, well, give me the names of all the Tutsis that are in your hotel. And he says, no. He says, well, if you don't, then I'm just going to kill everybody.
Right. And so they basically give him like an old list, or they basically kind of... And honestly, so in a lot of ways, and I don't know if I really thought about it to the extent until just now, although it should be kind of obvious, there's a lot of Schindler's List here in that
Yes.
he is keeping in his hotel Tutsis safe that would otherwise have been killed by the Hutu.
Right.
And even to the point where he's like kind of having his staff lie or saying they're part of his staff or giving the Hutu army false information about who's at the hotel so they don't.
Well, he gives them a list that's all like European names. It's all the white people that were staying there. And the guy says, this isn't right. There's no Europeans here. He said, well, that was the last list that we took. We stopped keeping track after.
Right.
And then he took all the numbers off the doors so that, it wouldn't show, who's where. And, and just like in Schindler's List, every time the army shows up, he's giving all the guys beer. He's like talking to them like they're friends.
Right, trying to schmooze them, yep.
Giving the guy the general scotch and everything. And then he even is like basically kind of like doing a false information. He's talking, hey, yeah, I overheard an American general, talking to somebody about how they're watching everything with spies and satellites and so be careful of what you're doing because, the Americans are watching. And he even at the end, he's like, tells them like, oh yeah, I heard the Americans say that you're on a list for war crimes. So you have to help me out so that I can basically testify on your behalf once this is all over that you weren't part of doing all the massacres because you're the general, you're in charge. Right.
And at the end of the day, ultimately the reason this I think was so impactful for me is I just have always had, I don't know, I get so... the idea of this senseless death on a scale where you're killing men, women, and children indiscriminately because they are on the other side of a line you made up.
Yes.
And the loss of life is so pointless. It always comes back to what I talk about, World War II, you could say is justified, World War I wasn't.
Yep.
So the same thing here. This killing is just so unwarranted, and the brutality with which it's done, and not treating people like people, and just you're getting rid of them as if they're vermin, and my skin just crawls, and I just can't handle it.
And this is like just another of like countless examples throughout history.
Oh, right. It's been going on for thousands of years.
Well, and specifically, and they showed at the beginning of the movie, just like when you talk about, somewhere like Nazi Germany or anywhere else where extremists are starting to do extremist stuff. And, people say, hey, he's driving with his buddy. Don Cheadle's character is driving with Dubé in the van. And Dubé's like, hey, man, these guys are talking some pretty scary stuff, talking about how we need to eliminate all the Tutsis and basically have a race war and genocide. And Don Cheadle says, those guys they're all fools. They don't know what they're talking about. They're so extreme, that they're not going to get any support. Their time will soon be over. Don't worry about it. And then what happens? Oh, no, actually that message resonates with a bunch of people, and they use this anger and the hatred, basically take advantage of this anger and hatred for the Tutsis that people have harbored since the colonial days and use it to start a race war, just like you see in Nazi Germany with them doing the same thing to the Jews. And it's one of those things where like that type of rhetoric is harmful and can lead to very bad things.
And it's the exact lesson I would hope that we would all get from this. It's this idea of othering people, basically saying, oh, this group is different from you and dangerous to you. And that's why it's so, I think, important to recognize that kind of language. And because we see it today in the United States with...
You see it in a lot of places.
Well, no, right.
I mean, yes, we see it in the United States, but I mean, it's just nationalistic and racial language in general. It can lead to this kind of stuff if it's unchecked.
Right. Yeah, the nationalistic stuff. Anything where it's focusing on our group is better or more worthy of continued existence, and this other group is out to get us if we don't stop it, then... So you look at like the war on terror. It's happening on both sides in the sense that if you convince Islamic extremists that the West is out to get them, that's othering, and it causes them to perform these acts of terror. But then conversely, when this is kind of more something that was kind of big 10 years ago, but you would get the people then in the United States who are then convinced that all Muslims are terrorists, and we just need to turn all that sand into glass and get rid of all of them. That's evil also, and it's that same othering that you're seeing that causes this kind of genocide here today. Or again, when I was talking about today's political United States climate, again, I feel like you get to where you see the rhetoric from the right kind of talking about that liberal is this buzzword, and that like liberals are the new group that is just to be disregarded and minimalized and is out to get you. But at the same time, then the extreme left, especially in like places like Twitter, will kind of talk about maybe that othering of the extreme right. And anybody who doesn't have perfect PC language is the enemy that needs to be gotten rid of. And so just anybody who's using that kind of divisive language and not willing to openly engage in good faith conversations just really needs to give you pause when you think about what they're saying. You can disagree with someone and not consider them the other that is a threat to your continued existence.
Right.
Well, not realizing there aren't, it's tricky though too, because you also want to otherize the agitators themselves while recognizing the group writ large is not the threat.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? If you're talking about Hitler, you do want to recognize him. Okay, we do want to otherize him. It's like basically those who are seeking to otherize this kind of need to be otherized themselves. It's kind of like, I always think back to, I think it was, Aristotle talked about, moderation in all things. And my joke was always, well, that takes an excessive amount of moderation. So, yeah, I guess there's kind of inherent contradictions, involved with all of this. So, all that is to say, within the movie itself, so it focuses on Don Cheadle's character running this hotel and just the atrocities they're witnessing, and things kind of go from basically he's running a normal hotel with lots of European tourists and expats that are just kind of, it's a nice place until this violence kind of comes on their doorstep, and they go from running this resort essentially to now it's a war zone, to now there's a genocide, to now our hotel is a place for refugees, and all based on a true story. And it's just this heartbreaking experience.
And then one of the other elements in this movie is the Europe and the United States, their complete unwillingness to intervene at all, basically. So Nick Nolte plays he's the UN commander of the UN forces there, and basically they think that the Europeans are going to come rescue them, and the Europeans do send a rescue force, but only to rescue the Europeans, and then they leave. And then they even show in the movie they're listening to a press conference. They don't show it, so I don't know who it is that's talking, but someone from the Clinton administration is talking about, oh yeah, we know there are acts of genocide, but we wouldn't consider it a genocide. And so the journalist on the other end says, well, how many acts of genocide does it take to constitute a genocide? And then, don't you guys know what's going on there? And he says, well, we don't know the full scope of the situation, and which is all a lie. Actually, there was a bunch of documents that got declassified in the early 2000s showing that they knew before the genocide even got to the worst that it was, they knew exactly what was happening. And there were directions given to say, to always preface the word genocide with acts of, so that you say acts of genocide to kind of try and lessen what was going on. They said, oh, well, yeah, it's, once it all started to come out, oh, actually, 1 million people died in Rwanda. They said, oh, well, we never knew the extent of the killing that was going on. They knew. They for sure knew.
Wow.
It was documented. But essentially, they didn't want to intervene for two big reasons. The first one was Rwanda just strategically didn't mean that much to the United States.
We don't benefit from it.
Right. They don't have resources. It's not a strategic location. What do we gain from intervening?
Whereas when it's the Middle East, we don't hesitate because of oil.
Right. I mean, and I would think that stopping 1 million people from being hacked to death with machetes, I would think would be maybe a reason for intervention. But again, I'm not a policymaker, so whatever. Take that as you will. But and then the other reason was, which I think Nick Nolte says in the movie, is that they didn't want a repeat of Somalia in 1993.
Oh, is that the Black Hawk Down stuff?
Yeah. After the Battle of Mogadishu, a bunch of Americans died. They ended up having to leave anyway, and it was kind of a failed UN peacekeeping mission, or not really. It was an attempt at a peacemaking that failed and just made everything worse. So they didn't want a repeat of Somalia in 93, so they said we're not about to start intervening in these conflicts in Africa anymore. So Rwanda, they're on their own.
The line in the film that always registered the strongest with me is Joaquin Phoenix as a journalist over there, who, as he's getting rescued and learns that there's basically no help coming for these people, but he's going to get out okay. He just says, "I'm so ashamed." And I think his delivery on that line too, he just sells it in a way that you're like, yeah, me too, bud.
The moment that had that impact, which that is a super emotional moment, but when Nick Nolte is talking to Don Cheadle, and he says, "We think you're dirt. We think you don't matter. The West, the power, nobody cares about you." He says, "You're not even an N-word. You're African."
Oh, wow.
Which, like, holy shit.
Right. And that's, like I said, just the issues at play. And then again, I think that is kind of a frustration that I've heard expressed is, okay, yes, you can say we don't have an obligation to intervene at the expense of American dollars and lives. But it's just the fact that seems so hypocritical when if it's in our economic interest, then all of a sudden we are willing to risk lives to help.
Right.
Help in the sense that it helps us economically down the line. So we'll let 1,000 American soldiers die if it makes corporations richer in the future. But if it's a place like Rwanda, where we'd probably have a less of a hard time because we have a lot of international support to kind of save these people, that we're like you said, we're not interested. Because, like you said,
but I can understand the argument of, well, the United States doesn't necessarily have to be the policeman of the world. So if it doesn't affect Americans, then who cares? But then when you do intervene, or you show a propensity to intervene when it benefits you, but not when it doesn't, then that's, I think, where it gets slimy and gross.
And what I've always thought, though, too, is, so yes, that would be the role of an entity like the UN, which the U.S. refuses to empower.
Right, and is also kind of at certain times hamstrung because in order for anything to get done there, basically the United States and is it United States, Great Britain, China, Russia, and France, I think, all basically have to align and agree. And while, yes, in 1945, that may have been, an easy thing to do or something that was even possible, I think now I don't think it's possible.
But man, who's saying no to stopping a genocide? I guess I don't see what's the no here, or is it just they didn't have the resources?
Well, it's also, so once the UN says, okay, we're going to intervene. Well, the UN isn't its own country. Somebody has to pony up the money, the resources, the supplies, the soldiers who are going to have to go there and actually do the fighting. So that's where it turns into, instead of everyone can agree, yes, that's bad, somebody should stop that. Well, why am I the one who has to pony up the guy? What's in it for me then? Oh, they don't have any resources? Yeah, I don't think we're probably going to get involved.
Wow. I don't have a good answer then. You're right. It's just a horrible, horrible situation. But again, I definitely wanted to put this movie on the list to kind of highlight the fact that these kinds of things are going on. And the movie itself is a 91% on Rotten Tomatoes. It was nominated for 3 Oscars, for Don Cheadle for Best Actor. His wife is played by Sophie Okonedo, who's nominated for Supporting Actress, and then Best Original Screenplay nomination. And it is actually one of the higher ones on our whole list here on the IMDb Top 250. It's number 224 all time. So this is a movie you need to check out.
Yeah, that it for sure is. This is a must watch, and I would almost say movie vegetable, not because it's like not engaging or it's boring or slow or anything. Like, you will be engaged, but it is so hard to watch
because it's such a tough experience. Yeah, great movie, worth the watch. Have the tissues handy, I guess, so to speak, or literally. So yes, next week is staying about the same time period, but we go up to the Balkans and deal with the Bosnian conflict in 2001's No Man's Land.